Welcome into our next section of notes where we're going to talk about Europe going to war. Now, again, we talked about the idea that there was alliances last time you guys watched a video, but World War I has really two main alliance groups. The Central Powers, which you can see in yellow, representing Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria to a lesser extent, and then the Ottoman Empire being the other of the kind of big three in the Central Powers. The big three in the Allied powers were Great Britain, France, and Russia. And then to a lesser extent, you could talk about the Serbs or the Italians being involved as well. Now, all these countries are going to go under what we call mobilization. And mobilization is just a really fancy way to say that a country is preparing for war. And that's really because going to war is a very logistically heavy activity. You need to make sure your supplies are going to the right places, that you have the proper equipment ready to fight, that you have the manpower needed to fuel your war machine. And what we see is that in almost every nation across Europe, we see that lots of people march off voluntarily to World War I because they feel this sense of national pride and that they're going to get to experience an adventure in a new country. They also think the war is going to be over very quickly and that they're going to be home by Christmas, which makes it so that people are much more inclined to go. In reality, the war is going to last about 4 years. During that time, 20 million people will die, and we're going to see that just because of the sheer amount of people, there's going to be conscripts and drafts that are going to happen to not only involve people from these countries that did not want to go to war, but also to involve the colonies to fight in this war as well. You can see in the summer of 1914 here, British men in line to join the army at the Tower of London, here dressed in their Sunday best, ready to go fight the Germans. This map also illustrates all of the different kind of conflicts that took place and or the involvement of all the different continents on Earth, obviously with the exception of Antarctica. Here's some Indian soldiers that were part of the British Army, as well as some African soldiers that were fighting on the front lines as well. On the Western Front, we really focus more so on the British and the French. And this side or this front is where we really kind of picture what World War I was like. This is where we see many instances of trench warfare where soldiers are dug into a position, they're living and fighting in these opposing ditches more or less, with this no man's land space in between that might be like a couple of kilometers or so, or a kilometer between the enemy trenches. During that time period, from about 1915 to about 1917, we see that the alliances are basically stuck in a stalemate where neither's really moving or gaining any meaningful ground moving forward. I'll post this video for you separately, but again, we'll look at a little bit with trench warfare here. You can see the trenches and no man's land in between from this aerial photo that was taken during the war. A German trench here with their snowed in position, some soldiers on the ground there, as well as this push to go over the top, where you would have these instances where you would try to charge and gain position by literally leaving the trench into oncoming fire from the enemies into what was no man's land that used to be a forest within Flanders, which would be southern Belgium. Some pictures of some soldiers here. And the ungodly disease of trench foot, where soldiers would oftentimes essentially get terrible infections and lesions on their feet from standing in wet, dirty, mucky water that would fill in the trenches. Again, a disease that no one would really want. This picture's from about 100 years after World War I, showing the scars still of the trenches, as well as some of the craters from mortar shells on the battlefields of what was World War I's Western Front. Just from a different angle. And on the Eastern Front, we have the Germans versus the Russians, as well as the Austro-Hungarians, but really mainly a conflict between the Germans and the Russians at this point. The Russians really suffer from the fact that they lacked a lot of supplies. They were short on food, guns and ammo was not necessarily a guarantee, as well as just basic wares of clothes and shoes was something that not all soldiers could be equipped with. And the problem becomes because of the fact that Russia doesn't have access really to warm water ports. You have this issue where Allied supplies really couldn't get to the Russians via any other way other than through the North Sea that was swamped with German U-boats or submarines. Germany and Austria-Hungary had very large armies, and this really starts to push deeper into Russia to the point where the Russians are going to have to leave before the war is over. And we'll talk more about that in a later topic. When we think about warfare within World War I, the thing that really kind of elevates this is the advanced weaponry. So as a result of industrialization, it causes battles to become these massacres, and that people are dying in larger quantities than in warfare prior to that. The other thing we start to see is due to advances in chemistry, the chemical warfare becomes much more commonplace as well, to basically try to flush soldiers out of the trenches by tossing poison gas into the trenches. And we'll watch this video actually here within the presentation.
The shift in World War I in terms of I think one really clear way of understanding the shift in World War I in terms of technology is that soldiers rode in on horses and they left in airplanes.
At the beginning of World War I, warfare is almost in the 19th century style. The French sincerely believed that going at the troops with determination, at enemy troops, is the way to go. What they don't understand is the collision of technologies.
General Pershing didn't believe in the trench warfare. He grew up on the plains fighting in Indian warfare where it was an open confrontation. So he trained his troops to fight in the open warfare. The British and French generals thought he was crazy. They criticized him for this.
It's impossible to cross that deadly beaten zone, the deadly zone between the two lines. The most determined line of soldiers cannot oppose a machine gun that fires hundreds of rounds a minute.
World War I wasn't just the first industrial war, it was also the first scientific war. It was the first time that societies had taken all of their resources of science and intelligence and said, how do we do this better? How do we fight better? How do we develop technologies?
A lot of the armaments you see in World War I had been used before: submarines, trench warfare, Gatling guns, machine guns. What happens during World War I is that these become mature and these become even more destructive.
During the war, the governments of all the different warring powers put enormous amounts of time and effort into scientific and technical development, so that the advancements which would have happened anyway happen at a much more rapid pace, and they happen according to the priorities of the warring powers.
Something happened in trench warfare that changed the course of the war and changed the way we understand warfare today, and that is chemical warfare.
The first gas attack was at a place called Vimy Ridge, and it was mostly Canadian soldiers who were being attacked. And the Canadian soldiers who were in the trenches saw this cloud of haze coming towards them. They had no gas masks. They had no equipment to protect them. Chlorine gas causes your lungs to fill with liquid, and so essentially you drown from the inside out. It was really the first war in which all of the technologies and science and industry of the 19th century were put to the sole purpose of killing people.
So continuing onward, again, one of the things that we talk about within this warfare is the fact that just like industrialization kind of speeds up the ability to make things, industrialization also speeds up how efficient machines are at killing other people. So machine guns, instead of a bolt action rifle, now can fire 450 to 600 bullets per minute, as opposed to maybe one or two. Grenade launchers and flamethrowers end up creating instances where killing can be done on a much more massive scale than prior to that. Tanks or land ships are also a great example of this, as well as airplanes and zeppelins now add another element to warfare where it's not just something that's being fought on land and sea, but then in the skies. We talked about the idea that gas ends up creating all sorts of problems within World War One, ends up causing some really severe injuries to individuals that are affected or attacked with these gas weapons during this time. World War One's also what we refer to as a total war, because countries basically have to devote all resources in the war effort if they have hopes of winning. Governments would take control of the economies, telling factories what they needed to produce in terms of war goods, asking everybody to support the war via bonds and rationing, limiting the amount of goods that you were purchasing so that they could, again, go to the front in order to fulfill the needs of the army. Propaganda was also used on the home front. Again, this attempt to really persuade people in what to do or what to think or how to act during the course of the war so that everybody was united in the effort. These are examples of ration books that were used during World War I, and then different posts of propaganda from the British, from the Germans, and from the Russians. Women in World War I are very much involved as well, transitioning from what were mainly textile jobs in factories to manufacturing weapons and ammo. Some even take on roles as police officers, nurses, and ambulance drivers on the front. And even some instances, like the Russians and some other countries, allowed women to see combat roles on the front. This also is a really kind of big move going forward because it changes the view on what women were capable of outside of their traditional domestic roles within Europe. So thank you for watching this slideshow, and I hope to talk to you guys again soon. Thank you.